My name is David Carter, Speaker of the House and MLA for Calgary-Egmont. After question period today, the House will be dealing with a motion other than a government motion, sponsored by the member for Stettler, Mr. Downey. And this resolution, which will occupy the afternoon, deals with privatization of Crown corporations within the province. Later this evening, the House will be dealing with the estimates of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund Capital Project Division.
Let us pray. O Lord, we give thanks for the bounty of our province, our land, our resources, and our people. We pledge ourselves to act as good stewards on behalf of all Albertans. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Very pleased today to have the opportunity of welcoming a parliamentarian to our midst, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Kenneth Wright, who is a member of the Legislative Council for the Northwest Province in Australia, is visiting Alberta. Mr. Speaker, he had the honour of being in 1983 to 85 the Deputy Speaker, or as it's called there, the Deputy President and Chairman of Committees. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, our visitor from Australia, his great-grandfather was born in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, and through a series of moves ended up with the British Army in Australia. Our guest, Mr. Speaker, had been in Canada in 1944 as a Air Force pilot, as a member of the Commonwealth Air Training Program, and it's indeed a pleasure to welcome him back here today. Mr. Speaker, I would ask the Honourable Kenneth Wright to stand, and he is joined today by Mrs. Wright, his wife. I would ask her to stand as well, and I would encourage all members of the Assembly to welcome these special visitors from Australia to the Assembly here in Alberta.
Presenting petitions.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to present a petition on behalf of over 1,060 Albertans who request that this Assembly direct the government to reinstate Alberta healthcare coverage of optometric services, including eye examinations.
Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
I beg leave to introduce a bill being the Insurance Amendment Act 1988. This bill will do two things. One, it will create the Alberta Insurance Council, which will allow for increased participation of the industry in increasing its accountability to consumers in Alberta. Secondly, it also provides for a compensation plan for life and health insurance companies.
The Honourable Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs has moved first reading of Bill 39, Insurance Amendment Act 1988. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number 39, Insurance Amendment Act 1988, introduced by the Honourable Ms. McCoy, is now read a first time.
Member for Chinook.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce Bill number 37, Soil Conservation Act, purpose of this bill is to encourage sound soil conservation practices and to provide the authority to prevent and stop soil loss and deterioration of land in Alberta.
The honourable member for Chinook has moved first reading of Bill 37, Soil Conservation Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number 37, Soil Conservation Act, introduced by the honourable member Mrs. McClellan, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 37, the Soil Conservation Act, be placed on the order paper under Government Bills and Orders for second reading.
Having heard the motion by the Government House Leader, those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to be able to table the 1987 report from the Provincial Senior Citizens Advisory Council.
Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs.
I'm pleased to file today the annual report of the Alberta Automobile Insurance Board for the year ending December 31, 1987.
Introduction of special guests.
Member for Ponoka, followed by the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, it is my privilege today to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly 55 energetic grade 6 students from the good town of Rimbey. Mr. Speaker, they are accompanied by teachers Ken Stemo and Jim Moore, and parents Donna Render, Val Nykirk, Debbie Hollingshead, Rita Fipke, Betty Gutterink, Linda Edge, and Janice Johnson. Mr. Speaker, they are seated in the public gallery, and I would ask them to now stand and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly several members of the Insurance Regulation Implementation Committee who have worked very hard with us in bringing forward the bill that was Bill 39 that was introduced earlier. They are sitting in your gallery, sir, and I would like to introduce them one by one and ask them to stand when they're introduced and remain standing until we can give them the traditional warm welcome. I do this in thanking them very much for their hard work. We very much appreciate the assistance and participation. Firstly, Walter Krochak, who is the president of the Insurance Brokers Association of Alberta. Thomas Ulevogue, who is representing the Life Underwriters Association of Canada. David Buzio, who is representing the Canadian Independent Adjusters Association. Des Haughey, who is representing the direct writing insurers. Bernie Rodriguez, who is our Superintendent of Insurance. Those who could not be present today are Nobby Kami, who is representing the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and John Graham, representing the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association. I would ask all members to thank these gentlemen for participating in shaping the future of Alberta in such a valuable way.
Red Deer South, followed by Calgary Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Legislative Assembly 44 bright and enthusiastic grade 6 students from the NEL Gates School in the constituency of Red Deer South. They are accompanied by 3 teachers, Mr. Ron Hitchings, Mrs. Marilyn Ganger, Mrs. Jean Rathwell, and 4 parents, Mrs. Sharon Drew, Mrs. Laura Johnson, Mrs. Darlene Hartfeld, and Mrs. Ruth Monroe. And I might mention, Mr. Speaker, that it's a very special day for one of the students. Carrie Payton is celebrating her birthday today with her classmates. I would ask that they would all rise in the members' galleries and receive the warm reception of this assembly.
Calgary Northwest.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege today to introduce to you and through you 45 bright and well-behaved students from St. Vincent de Paul School in the constituency of Calgary Northwest. With them today are 2 teachers, Mr. Michael Ross and Miss Cynthia Strulate, as well as parents, Mrs. Lacetti, who's also a member of the Catholic Separate School Board, Mrs. Cusano, Mrs. Phillips, Mrs. Lopez, Mrs. Sarkis, and Mrs. Stufelt, as well as their bus driver, Dale Gortson. They are sitting in the members' gallery. I'd ask that they would all rise and receive the customary welcome of the House.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to introduce to you and through you to members of the legislature a resident of my constituency, Edmonton Meadowlark, Mrs. Lindberg, who is here today in support of the petition that I just presented calling for the reinstatement of Alberta healthcare coverage of optometric services. I would ask that the members of the Legislative Assembly join me in welcoming Mrs. Lindberg.
Honourable members, I would draw attention to the fact that seated in my gallery today are 6 interns from our sister province of Ontario. They are here having meetings with various officials as well as with various elected members, together with our own interns. I would ask them to rise and receive your welcome.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, to the Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the federal government is in the process of launching legal action against the province of Alberta. It seems in this situation we go to the more ridiculous every day, but the subject of the lawsuit, Mr. Speaker, is an alleged refusal by the province to turn over 92 square miles of unoccupied Crown land to the federal government so that the federal government might transfer them to the Lubicon Band. My question to the Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, will the Attorney General advise whether such a request was received by the province and what action he took in respect of it?
Mr. Speaker, I have just received a copy of the statement of claim issued by the federal government today, along with a copy of the news release which they issued in relation to their decision to commence this legal proceeding. As honourable members are well aware, we have had negotiations underway for the last several months on this matter, and we have been unsuccessful in trying to break the logjam relating to commencement of meaningful negotiations between the 3 parties involved. Despite the imaginative efforts of our Premier and the Chief of the Lubicon Band to establish a tripartite tribunal to settle the issues, the federal government has refused to consider that particular proposal, and so they have proceeded the way they have today. We will be examining very carefully the statement of claim. Obviously, it has always been the intention and the interest of Alberta to negotiate a settlement with the other 2 parties to this matter. We stand ready, willing, and able to enter into those negotiations and would much prefer that course of action to have continued rather than to have the matter go before the courts.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree. We don't want it before the courts. But specifically, Mr. Speaker, I'm asking about the 92 square miles. And it's my understanding that this is what it's all about. My question again to the Attorney General, did the province or the federal government make that request to the province? Specifically, did they also offer compensation to the province as suggested by Davy E. Fulton under that agreement?
Mr. Speaker, the statement of no request directly for 92 square miles came from the federal government, indicating that in their view, would be the proper amount of land to settle this entitlement. I should point out that no one questions the fact that there is legal entitlement of land for the Lubicon Band. The size of that, the nature of compensation and so on that has to be dealt with has yet to be decided either by negotiations or, we have to, through the court process. I should point out that in the statement of claim there is a complex formula suggested as to the entitlement. And it's my understanding that while the Lubicon band has been asking for 92 square miles, the statement of claim does not advance that number of square miles as the amount the federal government believes to be appropriate. It's a smaller portion than that, but I must admit, just having received the statement of claim as I came in today, I haven't worked my way through that formula. I should point out, however, that the federal government has not, and I repeat, not offered to compensate the province of Alberta, as recommended by the Honourable Lee Davy Fulton in the report which was released finally and publicly last fall.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. In view of the fact that this has been going on for 48 years, is the province prepared to transfer at least some unoccupied Crown land to the federal government to provide for land required by the Lubicon Band? I'm thinking this would save us all a lot of money and a costly court case at this time.
The answer to that question is yes. And the 25.4 square miles, which was offered some time ago, we have offered to make available on a without prejudice basis to perhaps adding to that based upon a proper count agreed to by the parties as to the number of members of the band who are entitled to receive land under the Natural Resources Transfer Act of 1930. But the point I want to make is that and we also agreed that we would adjust the land location to accommodate the request of the Lubicons for the establishment of a new settlement on the shores of the lake. So we were certainly prepared to make that appropriate adjustment as opposed to the previous site that had been suggested. So we were certainly prepared to do that, and we still remain fully committed to carrying out that obligation.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about more. Part of this claim, it seems to me, is around, we can argue and quibble, but it's around the 92 square miles by this claim, Mr. Speaker. And my question is now, to avoid the court case, would the minister turn this amount of land over to the federal government so they can negotiate with the Lubicons, and in the process follow, I think we should get compensation and then start the process of negotiating with the federal government. This will save us costly court case and time.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this province and this government wishes to find a fair settlement. This, as the honourable member has indicated, the matter goes back to 1940. It would be unfair, however, to suggest that it has been in the process of active negotiation during that whole time. Obviously, it wasn't. But the province intends to carry out its legal obligations to the Lubicon Band and to the federal government pursuant to the action, pursuant to the requirements of the Act. And this is a process that we believe could have been much better dealt with the three parties sitting down together in the process that had been suggested by the Premier and in large measure agreed to by the chief of the Lubicon Band, rejected by the federal government. And the Premier may wish to add to my comments relative to that particular procedure that he had suggested. We felt it would have been much more appropriate than to drag the matters into the courts. The Premier may want to add to my comments.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly would like to make the clear position of the Alberta government that one of the reasons that we are being taken to court is that we did not want to make an agreement with the federal government that the Lubicon Band felt was unfair. My commitment and our government's commitment to the Lubicon Band is that we would settle it on the basis of fairness. And we were working with the Lubicon Band and hopefully the federal government as part of that negotiation in order to have an agreement
that the Lubicon ban felt was fair. That was the number one thing that the chief and I established when we started our discussions. Now, the federal government wants us to make an agreement with them that the Lubicon ban does not think is fair, and we will not do that. Therefore, we are being sued. So I think it should be clear that we are working with the band to try and get the band the agreement that appears to be fair, and that the federal government is suing us because we will not agree to act in a unilateral basis with them.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon, not Calgary Buffalo.
Meanwhile, we proceed to cash in on the oil right, left, and center while you're waiting and feeling sorry. Could I address my supplemental, Mr. Speaker, to the Attorney General? In view of the fact that there are a great number of Métis that reside within this area that we're going to be sued for, in fact, maybe as 50% as much as there are Lubicons, a number of Métis, and Métis are a provincial responsibility, not a federal one. What is this province planning, or what are their plans down the road for the Métis within the Lubicon disputed area?
Mr. Speaker, we have made it very clear that if the Métis who are involved in the land claim area are in any way displaced or moved, that it is the federal government's responsibility to compensate them for any change. And the federal government has agreed to do that. Well, please, the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party has already asked a supplementary, and he keeps on carrying a conversation with me while I'm in the middle of answering his question.
Thank you in this regard. That's enough of that. Further supplementaries on the issue. Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, also to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Ontario Premier David Peterson made a rather obvious point, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, he says, "You might get an agreement from a current premier that's prepared to live with this situation, but that doesn't mean his successor will do so. I would expect provinces like Quebec and Alberta, particularly those ones that have been strong provincial rightists in the past, will view this with some concern, if not now, in the future." We don't seem to have much concern now, Mr. Speaker, but my question is to the Minister. Did the Minister seek any assurances from the Federal Minister of Trade that Alberta could pull out of this arrangement? I say could pull out of this arrangement if it operates to the detriment of Albertans, or are we stuck with this agreement indefinitely?
Mr. Speaker, the nature of the question is a little convoluted in the sense that he quotes a premier from Ontario. I heard the premier from Ontario this morning on Canada AM, and I noted that his concerns that he had expressed there, but he was expressing the views of the province of Ontario, which have not been consistent with ours relative to the free trade agreement. That's been evident for some time. And the Premier of Ontario is perfectly free to express his views on behalf of his own province, but I don't think it appropriate that he do so for the province of Alberta or any other provinces for that matter.
Mr. Speaker, we're trying to find out if this government still believes in provincial rights, and provincial control of its resources. And that's the question, no matter what Peterson or whoever says. And my question again, did this minister, when he was talking to the Federal Minister of Trade, did he ask him about how Alberta might, at some point, pull out of this agreement if it was to the detriment of Alberta? Has it even been raised with him?
No. Mr. Speaker, we have not yet seen the federal legislation which may be introduced later this week or perhaps later in the perhaps the following week relative to what it contains with respect to implementing the agreement. So, as my colleague from Quebec has said, we'll wait and see what's in the federal legislation relative to its potential impact upon the provinces and their rights. But I can say this, Mr. Speaker, we have reviewed the agreement very carefully, and it does not infringe upon proprietary rights, interests, or ownership rights of Alberta and its natural resources in any way. That agreement was carefully reviewed by our government with respect to that matter. Obviously, since we have fought as a province and as a government to maintain Alberta's proprietary rights, ownership and interests, and in fact, as part of the 1981 Constitutional Accord, were successful in obtaining an enhancement of those rights in the Constitution of Canada. It would be certainly not in the interests of this province to abandon that position, and this government has no intention whatsoever of doing so.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, as he alluded to, at least the Quebec Minister of Trade is going to look at the document, but here we have this government saying we're for it no matter what. My question is, why doesn't Alberta make sure of the federal enabling legislation before it commits to supporting it, as we already have, Mr. Speaker?
Well, the honourable Leader of the Opposition has perhaps not understood quite clearly my response. I have said that we believe, well, the honourable member for St. Albert can't understand English.
With due respect, honourable minister, engaged in discussion through the chair rather than with St. Albert. Thank you.
Well, let me just conclude my answer. What I said is we support the agreement. We have not yet seen the federal implementing legislation, and we are going to look at it very carefully when it is introduced.
You're not being recognized as a supplementary yet.
And I have not said to this Assembly that we support the federal implementing legislation, because we haven't seen it yet. And nor has the province of Quebec, nor has the province of Ontario. We believe that we can and should have a very clear understanding of that legislation when it is introduced. And until such time as it is, and we have had an opportunity of reviewing it, it is hypothetical and premature to pass judgment upon it. But we do support the free trade agreement.
Mr. Speaker.
Amazing.
That's the point. That's the point, Mr. Speaker. We're prepared, as many governments have fought for provincial rights, to basically give this up because Mr. Mulroney told us. And we're such a cheerleader we couldn't back out now anyhow, and the minister well knows it.
That's right.
But my question is, following along the provincial rights, we know clearly it affects the energy, the pricing, even though the minister wouldn't admit to that. But I asked the Premier, does the Premier then take the view that he somehow has a mandate to abandon provincial rights, something we fought for, in pursuit of the so-called market pricing? Is this what it's all about, Mr. Speaker?
Yep.
Mr. Speaker, it's really strange, that question coming from a member of the NDP, who I recall leading the fight on provincial rights. And you know who we were fighting against? We were fighting against the NDP with their centralist point of view of placing power in bigger and bigger governments in central Canada to dictate to the rest of Canada. Now, this government has fought for provincial rights since 1971. We're continuing to fight. I find it interesting. I find it interesting that the Ontario government is now saying that they're the champion of provincial rights, when it was in their best interest, as a matter of fact, in the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, to allow provincial rights to be eroded. The Ontario government went along with the National Energy Program, went along with constitutional...
Thank you, Honourable Premier. I think we're all going to sit still for a couple of minutes.
Speaker, they went along with the NEP, they went along with the constitutional changes that eroded provincial rights. It was the Alberta government who fought for provincial rights. It's the Alberta government who has in the Constitution matters that protect provincial rights. We'll continue to do that. And I bring everybody in this legislature back to the fact that when back in 1971, the energy wars, 1975, we were fighting for Alberta's rights. The people we were fighting were the Liberals and the NDP. And if they've seen the light, then I think they should stand up and say they were wrong all those times. But in fact, this government will stand up for the rights of Alberta, and has in the past, and will do so in the future.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, what is puzzling is why they would roll over and play dead now after all those years. But supplementary to the minister, is he prepared to file a list with the House of those items that the province feels the federal government will need permission before they can commit the free trade agreement with the United States? What areas will the province require the federal government to get permission from the province before they will allow it to be signed away?
This is Chapter 8 of the Free Trade Agreement is one chapter that is in contention relative to provincial rights.
Thank you. Main question on behalf of the Liberal Party, Westlock Sturgeon.
Question is, this is to the Premier, Mr. Speaker.
Red Deer South supplementary on the previous question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize that the leader of the NDP's hands are tied by people like Broadbent and Shirley Carr, but could the Attorney General indicate, just as one example, how many additional dollars we might find in our provincial coffers had we had this free trade agreement in place 10 years ago?
Well, Mr. Speaker, forgive me, it's clearly hypothetical because it hasn't occurred. All right, main question, Westlock Sturgeon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always glad to yield the floor to the member for Red Deer South. He's always good for a laugh. Could the, Mr. Speaker, could
I'm sure that member isn't the only member of the House who has that kind of response. The main question, please.
Make your chore so light, Mr. Speaker. This is to the Premier, who I was horrified, Mr. Speaker, to learn on a tour of southern Alberta on the weekend that officials of the ADC, the Alberta Agricultural Development Corporation, are, in order to get quit claims from farmers, were threatening them with further legal action for monies that may still be owed if they had to go through a foreclosure. Mr. Speaker, the Premier should know full well that laws passed way back in the 30s stopped the lender from collecting anything more than the mortgage property on a foreclosure, meaning that you cannot chase a farmer for his wages or his crop or unsecured assets after you have foreclosed. However, this scurrilous practice is continuing. Will the Premier immediately order his ministers and the Ag Development Corporation to cease and desist this despicable practice of threatening farmers in order to get quit claims?
Mr. Speaker, the Associate Minister of Agriculture is responsible for Alberta Development Corporation. Ask her to respond.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be pleased to respond to that. If the member would give me specifics, I'll look into it.
Mr. Speaker, I will have no trouble filing in this legislature letters and testimony to show the rather scruffy practice of a government trying to push families off the farm with a law that doesn't exist. Would he also then, Mr. Speaker, tell his associate, using even his Associate Minister of Agriculture's figures, that 3,000 farmers in his province are on the ADC hit list for those over-enthusiastic collectors? Would he do something about going down and taking a tour in southern Alberta to visit these people and find out that his government is doing his damnedest? I don't blame you for turning around and passing this hot potato off.
Thank you. Order! Order! Perhaps the Minister would like to respond to the first question, but not to the second.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to make one comment, and then I'd like to have the Associate Minister of Agriculture reply, because we have made a tour of southern Alberta, Mr. Speaker, a very successful tour with Albertans, talking to them about the problems and helping them, and they came up with ideas, too, for solutions. We made a tour. We didn't just have a Liberal convention in the city of Lethbridge.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be pleased to answer that question.
More people on the cabinet.
As I was indicating, Mr. Speaker, I'd be pleased to answer that question because I've been down to southern Alberta on a number of occasions, on a number of meetings with various people in southern Alberta talking about the whole agricultural scene and the agricultural problems which are specific to southern Alberta in terms of debt and drought. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say that we've introduced the indexed deferral plan, which has been well received by people in southern Alberta and all over Alberta for that matter. I think that I've received representations on both sides of the issue from people involved in all of the communities. If the member would like, I'd outline the reasons for implementing the index deferral program, but it's specifically to ensure the continued health of agriculture and to allow the people who have debt all over this province to work through that problem in terms of the low commodity prices.
Mr. Speaker, thanks. I'm lucky I get 2 answers to every question, but that doesn't mean to cut my supplementals in half, Mr. Speaker. I like your kind cooperation, Mr. Speaker. With respect, back to the Premier again, can the Premier explain why in times of poor world prices and economics it is legitimate to, and most of the House supported him, to cut back the tax load and to cut back the load of small oil companies. But somehow or another, when farmers' prices go under, why is his government still the largest forecloser of mortgages in this province? He is the biggest, most rapacious landlender in this province. Could he explain why?
You know, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Liberal Party chooses his words very carefully to incite, distort, and mislead the Assembly. Frankly, I think I want to go back to his statement about the 3,000 people. It's absolutely untrue, Mr. Speaker, and I think that he should be honest with the people of Alberta and upfront and admit the assistance that we've given through the Department of Agriculture to assist the whole agricultural sector in this province.
Mr. Speaker, tell that to the farmers of Enchant, Vauxhall, Bow Island, and Medicine Hat.
Thank you. Order, please, honourable member. You've had sufficient number of supplementaries. The House is being more than kind to you. Let's have the question.
Is my last supplementary, is it, Mr. Speaker? Okay. Is it my last? Okay. I just wanted to make sure I left my big one till the last, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, just once again, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier if I can file evidence in this House of his people threatening these farmers with an illegal act if they don't do a quitclaim. Will he take action? If I can file that evidence in this House, will he take action?
Mr. Speaker, if I interpret his question as saying that he has evidence that their government is performing illegal acts, obviously, Mr. Speaker, there's no question. Anytime anybody is performing illegal acts in the name of the government, we will obviously do everything we can to correct that.
Thank you. Chair had recognized Edmonton Strathcona, followed by Little Bow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The short point is that the Agricultural Development Corporation is still threatening farmers with the action on the covenant, having got their land back or about to have their land back, something which is forbidden by the Act, but this is the question, but which they say they're exempt from because they are the Crown. When will the Minister tell them to stop doing that?
My understanding is that payment under the Crown is exempt under the personal covenant and that the Attorney General's Department is looking into that situation at the present time.
Thank you, Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Associate Minister of Agriculture, and this deals with young farmers that have already agreed to a quitclaim but have leased the land back for 1988. Could the Minister indicate whether there will be reconsideration of a longer-term lease back to those young farmers that have already reached an agreement with ADC so that they could possibly continue farming that land or continue farming in this province?
Mr. Speaker, it won't be the policy to do long-term leases on an open-ended basis, but if the farm has been tendered and has not sold, certainly they'll look at another lease for an extended year, for another year.
Okay, the member for Little Bow. Red Deer South, final supplementary on this issue.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Associate Minister. Could the Minister indicate to this Assembly just how long it takes to foreclose on a property under government policies and what the process might be?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Assembly that it takes a great deal of time to work through any settlement that a borrower and a lender may negotiate, either a quitclaim or a foreclosure. In the case of a foreclosure, it's absolutely the last option that ADC, or I would assume any other government agency, would want to be involved in. But in terms of the time frame, every borrower who is in a quitclaim or foreclosure action is far behind, generally speaking, in their payments, and certainly can't find the funds to make their operation viable. And if there's any way that they can do that, then we will look at it, and ADC will work with them to resolve the stressed financial situation in which they find themselves.
Member for Little Bow, followed by Tabor Warner, Calgary Mountain View.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Career Development and Manpower. There's been an increased demand for the summer temporary employment program positions. Could the Minister indicate whether there's been a reconsideration in terms of the numbers that will be allotted during this 1988 summer?
Mr. Speaker, it appears that with regard to summer temporary employment program, that our budget of $20 million for 1988-89 will be able to cover the demands that have come forward. It also appears that municipalities are using their own budgets in this particular year to hire part-time summer help, something that I do believe is appropriate, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe the municipalities should be using STEP solely as a way to create summer jobs and bypassing their budgetary process. We will assess it in that the high schools will be coming out shortly. We will have a greater sense of what demands we will have in the program for the months of July and August, and at that time we'll be making an assessment.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, some of the municipalities have been cut back in the initial application process. Would those municipalities have reconsideration at this point in terms of totally filling the request that they've made, or what other steps can they take?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have heard from a number of municipalities and employers that take up the summer temporary employment program. As a matter of fact, I just today dealt with a case in the honourable member's constituency, and there seems to be a misunderstanding in terms of the use of the dollars for STEP. In the past, municipalities have used the number of applications as a yardstick. We are using the number of months under each application as the yardstick for dollars, so that, simply put, last year if a municipality used 5 people for 4 months, and this year they could be getting 6 people for 2 months. It depends on how you use the yardstick in terms of the allocation of those dollars. We have tried to respond to every concern by every employer in the province on a personal basis. The department has been calling all of the municipalities that have asked about summer temporary employment, and to my understanding, they've been dealt with satisfactorily in the negotiations over the telephone. Edmonton Highlands.
Well, supplementary question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker. A lot of, in fact, almost every inner-city agency that's been in touch with me, which had applied for sometimes 4, 8-step positions, were denied almost all of them. In most instances, they only got one of all the people they applied for, all the positions. I wonder if the Minister is going to reconsider that policy from his department so that those agencies which do offer valued community service can provide those services through those positions.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be more than pleased to deal with a particular concern of a particular agency or nonprofit organization or municipality that feels that they are not getting a rightful allocation of STEP dollars. If the member wished to bring to my attention that particular case, I'd be pleased to review it as I do on a regular basis.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, with youth unemployment in this province already at about 15.2%, why does the Minister have to wait until June or July, to reassess the demand for this particular program? Can't he do that now and put up more funds for jobs for youth?
Mr. Speaker, I recognize and acknowledge that youth unemployment at 14% is far too high. I should also point out to the honourable member that it's down from 17% almost a year ago. So there has been a substantial reduction in the level of unemployment for youth in the province. I should also point out that last year we set a record in the province of Alberta for youth employment, the highest in the history of the province that we have for summer employment for young people. As I indicated earlier, I believe that our budget allocation for the summer temporary employment program will cover the demand that appears to be there today. I should point out that there seems to be a greater willingness this year than other years for the private sector to employ youth. So in that our budget is the same as last year, and last year we did set a record, I looked optimistically that we can employ a large number of people, young people, this summer. As I indicated, as the high school students get out and are looking for summer work, we'll be looking at it and assessing it. Right now, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that there is a need to do that at this particular point.
Main question, Tabor Warner, followed by Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that Section 110 of the Northwest Territories Act is still in force in Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan legislature passed legislation dealing with the question of French language rights and services in that province. As both Alberta and Saskatchewan have their foundations in the Northwest Territories Act, Alberta must also address Section 110. My question to the Premier is, will the Premier advise this Assembly when the Government of Alberta will introduce legislation pertaining to Section 110 of the Northwest Territories Act?
Mr. Speaker, there is a task force of the Cabinet headed by the Honourable Attorney General, and that task force has been working on the proposed legislation. They have been consulting with Francophone Albertans, other Albertans. They have reviewed the Saskatchewan legislation. Mr. Speaker, they will be making a final presentation as to the actual legislation to our caucus, and we intend to have this legislation introduced in the House during this session.
Supplementary to the Premier, can the Premier assure this Assembly and Albertans that any amendments will not fundamentally change the nature of Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, certainly the intention of the government to introduce, and it will be the Honourable Attorney General, introduce both a policy statement and legislation on behalf of the government. That would be to provide an opportunity to preserve the rights of Francophone Albertans, but at the same time, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the fundamental nature of Alberta as we now know it is not changed.
Premier Grant Devine has reportedly committed Saskatchewan to becoming fully bilingual within 10 years. I'm asking the Premier to comment as to the intent of the Alberta government in this regard.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not certain about Premier Devine's intentions, but I can say this. It is not the intention of the Alberta government to introduce through policy or legislation any moves to make this province fully bilingual. I can say, Mr. Speaker, make it clear to all members of the House and to Albertans, we are saying no to full bilingualism on a provincial basis for Alberta.
Additional, Tabor Warner. Additional supplementaries? No. Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. To the Premier, can the Premier assure this House that the government will take steps to recognize the rights of members of the Legislative Assembly to speak French in this legislature, not as a privilege as at present, but as a right?
Mr. Speaker, that will be one of the details of the policy statement and of the moves that the government makes in terms of legislation, because obviously that matter would be in the government's standing orders that would have to be dealt with. But I just want to make it clear that while we will be doing certain things to preserve the rights, we are saying no to full bilingualism on a provincial basis in Alberta.
Member for Calgary Mountain View, followed by Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was pointed out yesterday, when it comes to conflict of interest rules, this government tolerates a different standard for members of the Assembly than they do for others. Now we find in the new School Act conflict of interest rules for school trustees, rules that declare that pecuniary interests of these elected officials are extended to include corporations in which their spouse is a director, officer, or shareholder. My question to the Minister of Education, does the definition in the new School Act, Bill 27, set out the government's policy as to how pecuniary interest should now be applied for elected officials?
Mr. Speaker, I will take your direction, sir, but I believe that the issue is of import to the degree that it should be discussed in second reading and perhaps further in committee. I don't believe the question period is an adequate place to have a full discussion of pecuniary interest.
Well, the ruling of the chair as issued back in mid-April was the fact that questions would be allowed on bills until they had passed second reading stage, and after that, when they were in committee stage or third reading, questions would not be entertained during question period. So additional questions on this issue are permissible.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Light's green. I still didn't get an answer to the question. Is this now government policy as to how pecuniary interest should be defined for elected officials?
Who knows full well that you can't make a complaint about whatever the answer is, was, or may have been. Therefore, this is the first supplementary.
Minister of Education, is this now the government's definition in this School Act? Is this now the government's policy as to how pecuniary interest should be applied to elected officials?
Mr. Speaker, the government has presented a bill, which is Bill 27. It outlines a system by which conflict of interest can be determined, which is relatively consistent with the Municipal Government Act. I look forward to a further discussion of what is government policy when the bill appears in second reading and committee of the whole.
Mr. Speaker, these questions are about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Yesterday.
That's again inappropriate comment under Beauchene, honourable member. What's the supplementary?
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the provincial treasurer talked about laws reflecting the dynamics of the time. To the provincial treasurer, does he support this definition as set out in the School Act, that an elected official has a pecuniary interest in his spouse's business dealings?
My responsibility. Out of order. Appropriate question. It's not directed to the minister in terms of his responsibility as provincial treasurer. The question is asking his opinion with regard to another piece of legislation under another minister. Final supplementary.
Okay. Well, I'll ask the Premier then. Presumably he's competent to handle questions affecting all government departments. Will the Premier tell the Assembly
whether the government will take its policy of pecuniary interest as defined for school trustees and apply it to members of the Assembly of Alberta in their dealings and their spouses' dealings with Treasury branches.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be interested in seeing how the House deals with it. I'll be interested in seeing how the honourable member's party recommends that we deal with it. I'll also point out to the honourable member that we have a Legislative Assembly Act which is not being amended.
Member for Edmonton. Member for Calgary Buffalo, supplementary.
Well, the simple question to the Premier is, why is it that we have provisions for conflict of interest with respect to the school trustees which are more strict and stringent than those which apply to members of this legislature and of his cabinet? Why should school trustees have tougher rules than we have here in this legislature?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the legislature over the years has developed the Legislative Assembly Act to deal with members of the legislature.
Thank you. Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many of us believe that the Bosco Youth Ranch is an institution which the government should be more than happy to deal with. The ranch was given a mortgage subsidy of $36,000 by this government, so the government does have a stake in its survival. This institution has not asked, nor does it want, contracts or guarantees from the government. It believes in free enterprise and is willing to work on a per-client basis, yet the department appears unwilling to send clients to the Bosco Ranch. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Social Services, does the Minister of Social Services have any problems with the facilities or the quality of care that is being provided by the Bosco Youth Ranch?
Thank you. Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Question period is completed. Thank you. Thank you, honourable members. It is the right of any member of the House to give or withhold consent. The chair, nevertheless, must invite the Minister of Education to supplement some information from yesterday's question period in response to a question raised by Edmonton Belmont. Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to correct a statement which I made in question period yesterday in response to a question made by the honourable member for Edmonton Belmont, when I stated that, and I quote from Hansard, "There is nothing to prevent any local government from having a plebiscite on any issue they wish to have a plebiscite on," unquote. I've been advised that, in fact, school boards do not have the authority to call a plebiscite except in two circumstances: the dissolution of a local advisory board or the dissolution of a separate school district. If a board receives a petition from electors regarding a decision to build or purchase a new school or a decision to borrow money by debenture, they are required to put those decisions to a vote of electors. Those are the only situations in which a board can call for a vote on a particular issue. Bill 27 does not change the current situation, except in the case of formation of separate districts where the 25% quorum requirement cannot be met. Municipal councils, on the other hand, can submit to electors any municipal question or plebiscite over which a council has jurisdiction. Under the Local Authorities Election Act, the Minister of Education does have the authority to require a school board to conduct a vote of electors on any question specified by the minister or on a question on any matter under the jurisdiction of a school board. Mr. Speaker, on the particular issue of a ward system for the major urban centres, it is not the intention of government to direct the school boards involved to conduct a vote on whether or not a ward system should be established. Thank you.
Edmonton Belmont.
Supplementary question then, Mr. Speaker. If it's not the intention of the government to direct the school trustees to conduct a plebiscite on the establishment of a ward system, why not?
Mr. Speaker, government feels very strongly that the issue within Edmonton and Calgary is one where the majority of electors are of the view that a ward system should be in place. We feel that way because it certainly has been the input that government has received throughout the input on the School Act over the past few years, 4 years in fact. Responsiveness and accountability are key principles of the new school legislation, Mr. Speaker, and that is why government feels as strongly about the ward system in the major metro areas as we do.
Sure. Orders of the day. Might we revert briefly to the introduction of special guests?